Digital Media presents A Tales of the Sanctum story by Brian Joseph Johns. The Era of the Spellbound, Episode 1, Closer Than Close. 3 Little Ladies. A Natural Little Lady. May 3rd, early 2006. Shepperton, London, England. The sun shone brightly, overcast ever so slightly by the few clouds that pocked the sky in dabs of white and splotches of grey. The sound of children playing nearby kept the silence at bay as a solitary man, adorned in a cloak, watched them from the distance. If it were any other person, the citizens of Shepperton would certainly have seen him, even finding it strange that a man in his 60s or 70s would hold such captive interest in child's play. But this was no ordinary man. He stood from the bench he occupied and stepped forward in the direction of the schoolyard. The grass around his feet withered, along with the flowers that lined the garden through which he'd passed to get there. The irony was that he needed not to traverse this space in the prime plane, for he was not a regular in these parts, nor the dimension it occupied. Point-to-point linear traversal was only necessary to maintain his incognito status, for if he moved how he usually did, it would most certainly draw a lot of attention, and attention was something he sought to avoid. He preferred to be the floater in the peripheral vision of one's eye, rather than at the focal point in the center. He chose to be obscure, rather than obvious. His path wasn't a perfect line in the direction of his goal, but rather a diversion. He'd chosen to stroll through the field of living things because he loved the feeling of extinguishing their life, for it pleasured him. Not dissimilar to bathers who frequented beaches on hot days to feel the tingle of warm sand between their toes. For him, it was merely a thrill, and he worried little over the trail of dead foliage that was left in the wake of his step. The children played at the playground, their laughter and screams rippling through the air around them, perhaps presenting an illusory sense of safety to those who heard them. Some of them played on swings, while others on the climber, a few chasing each other in circles through the gravel-filled sandbox. Others with felt bags populated the nearby asphalt, playing marbles as part of a microeconomy that had developed, boulders and ball bearings having accrued the most value. A distance away, a little girl of no more than 12 sat alone, leaning against a tree, which itself was amidst a small grouping of other such oaks. Their shade provided a welcome shelter from the sun, though none of the other children dared to venture there, for it was where the strange girl liked to play. They simply kept their distance from her, preferring her absence more so than friendship. She didn't seem to mind this, and had long been used to the fact, for she was seldom truly alone. As the scene unfolded, it became apparent that she was not alone at all, for a family of squirrels, 3 of them in all, had acrobatically descended the trunk of the oak and circled it to find themselves in front of the girl. They sat there for a moment, the larger one leaning back onto its haunches as it looked at her with curiosity, as the other 2 remained hidden behind it, perhaps out of caution. The larger one then began to squawk and squeak, a long, protracted series of enthusiastic syllables coming forth from its mouth as its whiskers twitched sympathetically. The girl sat and listened for some time, and then responded similarly to the squirrel, without the benefit of whiskers, however. The squirrel, as had she, sat and listened carefully to her, and when she finished, it pondered what she'd said. At that point, a friendly smile stretched across her face, and she presented a handful of peanuts, still in their shell, placing them gently on the grass before her. The larger squirrel squawked softly to the 2 little ones, and they emerged from behind it and started gathering the nuts, perhaps a rehearsal in benefit of their own future responsibilities. When they'd filled their cheeks, they skirted the tree once again and scurried up as the larger squirrel moved close enough to grab the remaining shells. When the squirrel had reached them, a hand suddenly shot out from nowhere and grabbed the little creature up. A tall, cloaked man had appeared and was now standing to his full height with the squirrel firmly clasped in his fingers. "He's a friendly little fellow, isn't he?" the man asked her. The long cloak adorning his elderly body flowed as if gravity were alien to it. "She's friendly,"
the little girl responded, correcting the man who, by that point, had lowered himself and was seated on his haunches, not unlike the squirrel had moments earlier.
"Oh, yes, of course. She," the man responded with a smile, his voice barely concealing his resent at being corrected. "It takes someone special to be able to converse with these creatures, and with nature too, don't you think?" he asked her, still petting the squirrel as he gripped it, denying it any escape. The little girl looked to the man, trying to see his face, which remained hidden in the darkness that clung to him, while he smelled like an old, rotten mattress and stale bedding. She began breathing through her mouth to avoid the scent, her attention turning to the squirrel, who sat paralyzed with fear as the man's withered fingers stroked the creature's furry little head, its eyes bulging from their sockets with every stroke. She then noticed a most horrific sight. The squirrel's fur was changing color. Its shiny black fur was rapidly lightening, first dark gray and then grayish-white, as its body became thin and frail. "You're hurting her!" The little girl stood, confronting the man from behind strands of her shoulder-length blonde hair. A silence gripped her, and the air stopped moving. Stagnation had replaced the breaths of wind, while leaves began falling from the oak behind her, as if the autumn had arrived early. The surrounding oaks that neighbored it followed suit, and one by one they began withering, their branches quickly emptying of leaves. "Put her down!" the little girl yelled as a rage filled her, the dying grass suddenly rising up into sharpened spikes, as if spurred to action by her pain, though each blade withered further and died all the same. She cupped her hands over her ears, trying to stop an invisible pressure that had begun compressing her head. The little squirrel in the man's hands was now frail and shaking, thin and decrepit, as the man continued to stroke her. Suddenly, as if spurred to life by the girl's grief, a flock of birds that had previously been occupying the limbs of the tree suddenly swarmed downwards, encircling the man and little girl both. They flew inward, tightening their circle with fierce aggression towards the man, pecking at his cloak and ripping at his form, feathers and dust flying everywhere as they did. The little girl screamed as she hung onto her head, trying to relieve herself of the pain and pressure. The whirlwind of birds that surrounded him then perched upon his form, covering him completely as they clawed at him with their talons, their wings flapping furiously, the girl's pain driving them to protect her. As the pressure reached a crescendo, the tension suddenly broke, and the man vanished, the air he'd occupied collapsing with a loud pop, leaving the girl who'd fallen to her knees, gasping for air as she hyperventilated from the stress. The birds gathered themselves in the air, and then together they flew up and into the trees, the lush foliage that had covered the branches slowly returning. There upon the ground, before the little girl, the squirrel got to its feet, still frail and struggling as its fur slowly darkened and life returned to its drained little body. The little girl's hands fell from the sides of her head. She then pushed herself to her feet and ran over to the squirrel. When she saw that it was healthy again, her breath returned to her, eyes suddenly tearful with both joy and relief. A short distance away, and from amidst a group of panicked children, one of the teachers had arrived, hollering her name as she ran in the little girl's direction. "Naloni, Naloni, are you all right?" the teacher yelled, kneeling down beside her to ensure the little girl's health. The squirrel darted up the tree, grabbing the last remaining peanut, as the two little ones peered out from their nest just before disappearing to eat their bounty. "I'm fine." Naloni defied the sudden attention of her teacher, instead her attention on the squirrel as it fled. "You shouldn't be playing with the animals. They could bite you, or worse, you might catch a disease. And with your hypertension, I don't want to even think about what could happen. Do you understand?" Mrs. Griffiths held on to Naloni's wrist, but gently, as she tried to make her point. "Could you just leave me alone? We still have 10 minutes left," Naloni said to her as the teacher in her early 30s released Naloni's hand. "All right. How's your little friend?" asked Mrs. Griffiths, her intensity now dissipated. "She's fine. Hungry, but fine." Naloni looked down to the dirt where the man once stood. Mrs. Griffiths turned and began walking back toward the schoolyard, where the child's play had already resumed. "Mrs. Griffiths?" asked Naloni as her teacher left. "Yes?" Mrs. Griffiths slowed, turning around to face Naloni. "Thank you," Naloni said to her,
looking up from the ground to face the older woman. "Get yourself back to class in time, and maybe next time we'll bring a big bag of walnuts for your friends and feed them together." Mrs. Griffiths turned and walked away. A Shadow Requires Light. May 6th, a decade and a half ago. Shepperton, London, England. The guitars ground the notes into a fine pulp from where they were pushed by the bass towards the double kick. From there, they were compressed into a solid and continuous beat, hidden well within the iPod earbuds of a 17-year-old girl, their white wires contrasting her pitch-black gothic eye makeup against her blazingly bright red hair. The aspects of her individuality she'd both cherished and retained, despite the enforcement of her wearing a school uniform. She walked the length of the halls of Halliford High, hidden within her own world, a place whose walls were well defined by the sounds of the alt-goth rock music to which she was listening, and whose darkness she felt a sense of familiarity within, while the world of light mocked her without her awareness. "Oi, mate, here comes trouble," said Neville, one of the male students to his best friend Wes, who, upon seeing the school's most notorious redhead, ran his fingers through his jet-black spiky hair. "Don't be such a mappet, she's just chillin'," Wes responded, reaching into his locker to grab his history books for class. "Gotcha, you think she's peng, mate, don't you?" accused Wes mockingly. "Wait, however, I'm not such a bellin' like one of my mates," Wes responded, slamming his locker door shut and throwing his backpack over his shoulder as they trailed the girl from behind. Neville picked up his pace and caught up with Wes, and then quietly snuck up behind the redhead and tapped her on the adjacent shoulder from the side which he was standing. She turned around, and Neville by that time was already on her other side, leaving only Wes to face her, nearly bumping into her. She faced him now, her foundation-painted face as pale and white as her earbuds, her brushed eyes and red lips heavily contrasted by the black makeup pencil with which she'd outlined them.
Wes stood there looking at her, very much dumbfounded and lost of words, when she pulled the earbuds from her ear, using her other hand to stop the iPod. "Can't let a girl well enough alone?" she asked him, her voice piercingly brazen with boldness and confidence as she looked through him with two chillingly blue eyes. "You can't live in the world like the rest of us?" Wes asked her, seeing Neville over her shoulder, who was now a good distance down the hall, laughing as he walked backwards to keep track of their progress. "What world? It's all going to the wheelie bin," she said to him, once again looking right through him. "Well, you could at least pretend to like it. Might be fun, like your earbuds," Wes suggested to her. She simply watched him much the same way as a cat might watch a bird just before it pounced, perhaps enjoying seeing him shed his feathers in fear. "Are you on your way to a wake or something?" he asked her. "No, a funeral. For the world, and I'm in mourning. Walk with me," she said to him, offering him one of her two earbuds. He accepted it and placed it in his ear, quickly removing it due to the volume. "You planning on retiring your floppers early?" he asked her, handing her earbud back to her. "Floppers? Mine are tinier than yours. If your hair was much shorter, you'd be aerodynamically unsound with ears like that," she responded to him as they began walking together. "That's my da's side for you. Big ears. Mama, she's always goading me about it," he responded to her remark, though she'd suddenly become quiet. "What about your parents?" he asked her, prompting her to immediately cut him off. "Is that how it's going to be? Play soft and then go in for the kill?" she accused him, immediately grabbing her earbuds from her pocket and replacing them in her ears as she picked up her pace. By that time, they'd just passed Neville, who was leaning against a nearby school locker just outside of the class whose doorway she'd just stepped through. "So, how'd it turn, mate?" Wes asked Wes. "Like rubbish, in the skip," Wes responded, crumpling up a candy wrapper from his pocket and tossing it into a nearby trash bin, which he then leaned against. "What'd you say to her?" asked Neville. "Nothing, just talked about my ma and da's all," Wes replied, folding his arms across his chest as he lost his balance and nearly fell in the trash bin himself.
"Oi, Wes is right up there in the mush, cheering with his hands for the peng of his dreams. And then, like a chav, he crashes to the floor. You didn't know? Her parents are pushing up daisies. So I heard," Neville told Wes. "No, really?" Wes confirmed, his voice becoming weak and withdrawn. Her ma first, when she was like 3. Her dad, he was like 50 all the way. Bought it during an investigation at a South London warehouse. He was shot dead. It was in the news back in 99. Kapow! Neville told Wes, lacking restraint in his slang or his performance as he faked being shot, falling to his knees in the hall in front of Wes. Wes shook his head at Neville in disgust. You're the real bellend, mate. A real London chav, you are. A class act all the way, Wes said as he abandoned Neville, stepping into the history classroom. Neville felt a menacing presence from behind him and turned to face it, bumping into Headmaster Braskins as he got to his feet. Neville brushed the dust from the knees of his blue slacks. Afternoon, Neville. Aren't you supposed to be getting ready for track and field? Headmaster Braskins asked Neville. I was just on my way. Neville immediately turned and ran down the hall, quickly running out of breath, realising that he had less than a minute to get into his locker and get his track shorts. Wes searched the room for a desk from the front of the class, seeing his favourite already occupied by one of the more brash jocks of the bunch. In a desk nearby, a blonde-haired girl sat, doodling on a notebook with a pencil, drawing a sinister-looking stick man in a hood and cloak. In the desk 2 over from her sat the redhead, her earbuds still drowning the world out as she mourned for society and the world she had left behind. He eyed the only remaining seat, which lay between the blonde-haired girl and the redhead, both of whose names he realised that he didn't know, kicking himself for not having asked the red-haired goth girl for hers earlier. Not realising that she was still hiding from the world behind her earbuds and buried in her music, he spoke, addressing her formally and with respect. Can't really say I've been as brazenly careless with the girl's art before, but I could make it up to you if you'd give me a chance, he said to her, not looking directly at her but from the side as he placed his history books upon his desk.
She can't hear you, the blonde-haired girl said to him. I'm sorry, and you are? He asked her. She can't hear you because she's mourning the world, the blonde-haired girl continued as if she heard him, deeply into her doodle art. Are you an artist? He asked her. Does it look like it? She responded, revealing the stick figure she'd drawn on her notebook. Well, maybe. He paused, not daring to risk another girl's dignity that day. I'm no artist, not really. I'm Nelanie Ardbloom. She introduced herself to him. What's that around your neck? He asked her, pointing to a necklace which held a pouch in the centre, just above her breastplate. She reached up and loosened a drawstring on it and revealed a fragrant and colourful tiny flower that was growing within. It's my perfume. She turned to face him and smiled, blushing as she did. The flower seemed to accent her naturally pink lips and flushed cheeks, and he found himself suddenly in admiration of her in much different way than her regard for the red-headed girl. That's brilliant. Are you a tinker? An inventor, maybe? He asked her. Not really. I just like the smell, the colours, the feel of a living thing so close, she responded, blushing once again. How utterly boring. That's so droll, the red-haired girl suddenly spoke up from the other side. Not as droll as spending your life hiding. So glad you could finally join us, Nelanie responded to the red-haired girl. Well, I wouldn't read too much from it. I just had to move my jaw and lips to avoid rigor mortis from setting in with a friend like Nature Girl over there, she responded, addressing Wes but referring to Nelanie. Does Bela Lugosi know you're wearing his duds? Tell me, Shigor, how's Dr. Frankenstein? Nelanie responded, clearly capable of defending herself against the Gothic mistress. Oh, he's fine. He told me to ask you not to raid the local park's flower beds. Speaking of which, they grow those flowers in cow dung, she responded to Nelanie. No, they don't. You're just jealous because my flower is brighter red than your hair, Nelanie replied, her chin elevated in victory. Let's get a second opinion on that, the red-haired girl responded, looking to Wes and then winking at him as if any of his earlier transgressions had been swept under the proverbial rug.
All right, deal, Nelanie replied, carefully removing her living potpourri necklace from her neck and then carefully handing it to Wes. Gently now, that's a living, thriving wonder of nature, she said, placing it in his hands. Wes suddenly felt like the same bird he'd been earlier, only this time instead of one cat, he was now caught between two. The
The red-haired girl moved closer to Wes, even close enough that he could now smell her fragrant red hair. He held up the living potpourri necklace next to the red-haired girl's hair and checked it carefully in the light of the classroom as silence fell over the scene. The red-haired girl looked at him, her eyes much less intimidating this time, as he admired both the smell and colour of her hair. His eyes darted back and forth between her hair and the flower and her hair again until he decided. It was really, really close, but I'd have to say that it was her hair, Wes said to her, now unable to take his eyes off of her. And there you have it, nature girl. The red-haired girl smiled, slowly making her way back to her own chair and desk as Wes watched her. Wes then turned and handed the flower back to Nelanie, a slight look of regret and sympathy on his face, though her smile still held fast and strong. No worries, they only get brighter. They're the brightest when they bloom, you know, she said in a most flirtatious fashion. Wes smiled at her and nodded respectfully, admiring her that much more, though he kept his gaze upon her for only a moment longer before returning his attention to the mysterious red-haired girl. I've been ever so rude and I apologize. I'm Wes Davies at your service. He smiled at the red-haired girl, leaving everything up to her from that point forward. She looked to the pile of books she'd laid out before her on the desk and to a book of astrology, thumbing through its pages quickly before closing it again. She then turned her attention to Wes, her blue eyes now soft and nurturing, at least as much so as the affectionate colour of her bright red hair. Wes Davies, my name is, she began, as a loud and pronounced voice interrupted her. Sheila Sheowellen! A man's bold voice broke the attention they'd placed upon each other, and they all looked to the front of the classroom at once. A man had silently perched himself at the teacher's desk, though he was not the same teacher that had normally delivered their lessons.
You are finished, I take it? He asked her, looking right through her as she'd looked right through Wes earlier. It appears so, she responded, unsettled yet unintimidated by the teacher's glance. Mr. Corkum has called in sick. I'm Mr. Norbid. I'll be taking over for him today. Mr. Norbid stood from his desk, counting the number of students in the class with a piece of chalk in his hand. Seems we have everyone, so we'll just skip attendance and get right into the lesson. Today we'll be speaking of the Revolution of 1654. Mr. Norbid turned to the chalkboard where a rough map of North America was drawn in bright green chalk. Who can tell me where this is? He asked the class, and the jock's hand went up. Mr. Feldman? Mr. Norbid addressed him. That's North America, Mr. Feldman responded, quickly leaning forward in his chair from where he'd been against the back wall. Very good. Now, who can tell me what this is? Mr. Norbid asked the class, as he drew a chalk line across the Atlantic Ocean, from where Europe would have been situated, following a waving line that found its way to the entrance of the St. Lawrence River. Wes put up his hand. Mr. Davies, Mr. Norbid acknowledged the young student. That's the path that colonizers took to North America. Possibly James Wolfe? Asked Wes. Close. This is 1654 we're talking about, remember? Who can tell me what happened in 1654? Mr. Norbid turned away from the chalkboard to face the class. Nelanie was the first to feel it. The classroom had suddenly dropped in temperature, and a shadow had spread throughout the schoolyard as a storm closed in around the school. A flash of lightning flooded the windows, making some of the students jump in their seats. Shayala felt her skin tingle as the sound of distant thunder closed in on them shortly thereafter. Wes looked to Shayala as she glanced to him, perhaps seeking the solace of a familiar face for the first time. The two of them then looked over to Nelanie, whose fright was visibly upon her face as the sound of rain upon the aluminum windowsills filled the room. The teacher stood silently at the front of the class as the lights went out. The bright flash of lightning once again broke their pause, and then the crash of thunder, spurring Nelanie to scream aloud while spurring Wes into action. He stood from his desk and looked around the class, but found it to be devoid of students. Instead, what he did see was that all of the wooden desks had been piled upon one another, and from their midst were 3 poles rising to a height beyond where the ceiling had once been. Each of the poles had straps affixed to them, perhaps bindings to hold a prisoner in place. By this time, the roof had disappeared, and they were now out in the open as the rain pounded them from above. Wes ran his hands through his soaked hair as Nelanie grabbed one of his arms for protection, and Shayla the other, both women on the verge of tears. Somewhere in the distance, a chanting of many voices had picked up and joined the sound of rain that battered the ground from above. "Where's Mr. Norbit?" yelled Shayla. He suddenly appeared with the most recent burst of lightning. Gone was his formal school teacher's attire, replaced by a hood and cloak.
his wet face shining in the lightning, giving Melanie a glimpse of the man behind the hood. What she saw was a face she'd not seen in nearly 6 years. "Remember me?" he said to her as he stood before her, her eyes fixated on his. When she'd mustered the strength to break away from his gaze, she looked down to his hands, where he grasped a familiar squirrel as the other hand stroked its head. She screamed at the top of her lungs as the squirrel quickly aged until only a receding layer of rotting flesh and a tiny skeleton remained. "This rain, the world's tears, for its mourning for you," Mr. Norbert said, looking to Shayla as if mocking her earlier conversation with Wes. Wes recognized this and forced both Melanie and Shayla behind him. "You brought this upon yourselves, for you lust for something more, something hidden that only the chosen are meant to know," Mr. Norbert said to them, though they knew not about what he was speaking, and his words merely confused them as fear gripped them to the core. "These tears from the sky are for you. Realize that to yearn is to cry, and to learn is to die," Mr. Norbert said to them, all three, as they backed away from him, eventually running into what remained of the school's walls as he closed in on them. "You broke the line, but you can unbreak it. The boy. You only have to give up the boy," Mr. Norbert said as he threw his hand violently forward, pointing at Wes, the squirrel's skeleton tossed to the mud accumulating around their feet.
Unbreak it. Give him over, and together we will cleanse the broken line in fire.
Mr. Norbert by that time had closed the distance enough that he reached forward and clasped Wes by the wrist. With a tremendous tug, Mr. Norbert pulled at Wes. Behind them, the pile of desks had become a pyre, flames shooting skyward. He pulled again, and Wes no longer had the strength to resist him, but Neloni and Shayla both held him firm and in place, daring not to let him go. "No, I'm losing him!" Shayla screamed, digging her shoes into the mud as she slid towards Mr. Norbert, struggling to resist his tug of war for Wes's life. Water poured down, drops of it bursting upon Neloni's head and from there dripping onto her potpourri necklace. Upon the flower within becoming soiled with rain, it suddenly spurred to life, rapidly growing, breaking free of its binding as it fell to the mud. Its roots found purchase in the soil, quickly piercing the slime and the dirt until it found solid, firm soil to hold it in place. It then grew upwards and against the force of the rain, wrapping around Neloni's legs first and then Shayla's, holding them both firm where they were. Wes slipped, and for a moment as he struggled until it appeared he'd been taken from them. His hand reached out towards them as Mr. Norbert pulled him towards the pyre, readying himself to cast Wes into the flames and unbreak the broken. But at that moment, a branch quickly grew from the flower's stem and wrapped around his wrist, holding all three of them against Mr. Norbert's zealous fury. Mr. Norbert gave it everything he had as he wrenched Wes's arm, almost ripping it from its socket. Then, all of a sudden, with the bright flash of a lightning strike and coinciding crash of thunder, they were all cast into darkness and silence. The lights came on, and they were once again seated at their desks. "Shayla Llewellyn," Mr. Corkum tallied the attendance sheet from the front of the classroom as Neloni, Shayla, and Wes looked forward in amazement and disbelief. The classroom had returned, and the class had begun, though there was no sign of the other teacher. "What happened to Mr. Norbert?" asked Shayla of Mr. Corkum. "I'm sorry? Who?" Mr. Corkum looked at Shayla, an expression of puzzlement on his face. "Mr. Norbert, the supply teacher." Neloni backed up her friend.
"He was here. Where is he?" Wes looked both to Shayla and then Neloni, the three of them having realised their bond. "I'm sorry, but the only supply here is an overabundance of imagination and a poor sense of humour," Mr. Corkum said to the class, drawing laughter from the other students at the expense of the three, and from there the class went on, as it did every other school day. Neloni, Shayla and Wes spent every class from that moment forward together and in support of each other. They never spoke about Mr. Norbert, and they never had another experience like the one they'd had that day. That is, until their final form of high school, exactly 1 year later. Until that time, the only confirmation they had about their experience was the nightmares that would mark every single night of their life until that point. Nightmares where the chanting repeated the same lines over and over again. To yearn is to cry, and to learn is to die.
The Artist Alone. May 6th, Year 13. Shepperton, London, England. The Bentley was parked in the passenger pickup area, the driver standing in front of the car, a cardboard sign in one of his hands, his phone in the other, and pressed up against his face as he spoke with someone on the other end. The sound of a jet on its final approach rose in volume until it drowned his voice out, despite his best efforts to speak louder and louder as it passed overhead. "Sorry about that, honey. So, how's the weather there in Waterloo?" the driver asked. "It's a pretty hot afternoon, nice enough that Cindy and I might go out and catch a flick tonight," a sultry woman's voice replied to him. "What movie?" the driver asked. "I don't know. Maybe The Prestige, The Illusionist, maybe The Lady in the Water. That might be good. So, what are you going to be doing tonight?" she asked him. "Studying for sure. Exams are next week and this is the last season before the big year. Just think, this time next year and a thesis later, and I might be a full PhD," he said to her proudly. "Have you decided yet?" she asked him. No, I haven't. I think it's a bit early to discuss this, don't you?" he said to her. No, it's not. This isn't just your life. I deserve to know. This affects both of us," she said to him. "Look, I've got to go. Her flight just arrived, and this is probably going to be a little tense. Let's talk about this later, all right?" he asked her. "All right, but you're not going to sidestep again this time. I want to know, are you going to stay there, or are you going to move back here?" she asked him, trying to trick the answer out of him. "Bye, honey. I'll call you tonight." He deflected her question and then hung up, pocketing his phone and then clasping his sign in both hands and holding it before him. He situated himself like a few other drivers beside him on either side, ensuring he could be seen, and when he was in position, they started arriving from baggage area in several different crowds. He'd seen photographs of her before, most of them accompanying her portfolio, though a few had been taken and sent to him via Messenger app on his phone by the agency to ensure he'd not miss her. When the first group arrived, pushing through the passenger pickup doors, he straightened up and put on a friendly smile, looking at everyone passing through the doors while trying not to appear like he was looking at them. Most of the group quickly found a cab or van, with the remainder hooking up with their respective drivers, particularly those who stood alongside him to either side. Their parking spots, once freed, were quickly taken over by other drivers, who again set foot out front of their car and presented a sign seeking their particular passenger. This continued for the next 10 minutes, with 4 groups leaving the terminal and quickly finding their transportation shortly thereafter. It wasn't until the 6th group that he noticed a young woman, perhaps approaching her late teens if not early 20s, as she pulled her wheeled baggage behind her. Her black hair was quite long, falling gracefully over her shoulders, while her bangs were trimmed in a perfect line that stretched across her forehead, just above her brow line. She looked down as she walked, though that did little to hide her puffy blushed cheeks or her rounded lips that peeked out from beneath her nose, a smooth and well-rounded chin supporting it all with grace and balance. He looked to her, perhaps 5 feet and 9 inches tall in her low-rise heels, her tiny frame not much bigger than her luggage, though she seemed to be doing all right pulling it through the door. He then stood tall and held up the sign and said, Mila Wren Dubell?" He looked right at her, already knowing that it was her.
She looked up and towards him, presenting a short but sufficient smile to acknowledge his sign, and walked towards him, pulling her luggage behind her. He quickly pocketed the sign and greeted her. "Mila," he confirmed with her. "Yes, that's me. You're not British?" she asked him. "No, I'm not. I'm from Canada too. I work for the agency part-time as a driver, picking up arrivals and running errands, making ends meet. I guess it was sheer luck that the agency picked me to come get you. How was your flight?" he asked her, picking up her luggage and carrying it around to the boot, which he then opened, placing her luggage within. "It was fine," she replied quietly, seemingly feeling no need to talk further, which suited him. "Do you prefer the front seat or—" he asked her. "That'll be fine. I'll take the passenger seat if you don't mind," she asked him, bowing to him a few times out of politeness. He too bowed, though he wasn't quite sure why. He went around to the passenger side and opened the door for her. She bowed again quickly and got in with a quaint but withdrawn smile. He went around to the driver's side and got in the front seat. "Have you been here before?" he asked her, as he searched for his keys. "No," she replied.
Your place isn't too far from here, south a bit, not to mention it's near a lake. It's quite scenic too," he said to her, starting the car. "Your name, is it European?" he asked her. "Last name? Austrian, possibly Belgian, I think, on my father's side," he said to her. "And your middle name?" he continued to press her. "Japanese. My mother was Japanese," she continued. "That would explain the bowing. All that, and you're from Canada too," he said to her. "Look, could we just keep this conversation to a minimum? I'm exhausted, and I'd like to get to my residence and sleep if it's all the same. I don't mean to be rude or anything, but you're putting me in an awkward position, and I feel very uncomfortable talking about this," she said to him, turning to face the passenger window. "Very well, I'm sorry," he said to her, clearly not meaning it at all, but offering it up automatically without thinking about it. She didn't answer him, instead making another request of him. "Could you wake me up when we get there? Maybe use the horn," she suggested, preferring that he not touch her.
"Certainly. Good idea," he said, as he pulled the car out from the parking lot, navigating the length of it until he found the exit. From there, he pulled out onto Southern Perimeter Road, finding his way to a roundabout and onto Bedfont, and then Stanwell. By that time, Mila was fast asleep, the early afternoon sun warming her hair through the passenger window against which she was leaning. She'd been in the terminal at Pearson International Airport in Toronto, though it was much different than she'd remembered it. For one, the jets pulled into the building itself rather than the docking bays as they usually had, the terminal being lined with escalators and ramps leading up to the doors of the various aircraft. She'd been lying sideways on a bench, fast asleep, having been there waiting for days when she'd awoken in the strange airport. She sat up, her toes feeling cold on the granite floor. She spent half a minute locating her shoes before getting onto her feet and searching the terminal for a particular flight. She'd come all the way from Paris, France to get here, and had left early in order to ensure that she didn't fail at her intended task. She'd been at the Louvre, presenting her work, her first ever, when she'd realized that something horrible was about to happen. She'd been speaking with a small audience viewing her work, when the realization struck her. She looked around in terror, panic thick upon her face, as she ran from the gallery and through the immense foyer, navigating people and displays alike until she flew out through the front doors. There, upon the road, in front of the Louvre, was a chartered jet, a big one which miraculously sat in the middle of the triple-lane road, lined up for takeoff. She quickly climbed the ramp and was on board, the flight attendant not waiting for her before signaling to the pilot to taxi for takeoff. She quickly found a chair and strapped herself in as the oxygen masks fell from the ceiling. She clipped one to her face and woke up hours later on the bench at Pearson. After she'd found and donned her shoes, she got up to look around and get her bearings. The jets in the terminal were all loading, readying for departure, directly to Le Louvre, when Mila recognized the passengers she'd been seeking. At that point, they were already up the escalator and into the door of the plane as the flight attendant closed and locked the door.
Mila screamed at the flight attendant as she burst out in tears, pleading for her to open the door. She ran up the escalator and pounded the door with her tender bare hands, screaming and crying as she did. The jet began to move away from the escalator, and she quickly looked through the passenger windows as they passed, searching for a pair of familiar faces. As the wing arrived, she spotted them, both of her parents peering out from a window. They smiled and waved at her as the jet picked up speed, turning in the terminal in order to line up with a gigantic garage door that had opened to accommodate the jet's exit. She screamed at them as they watched, pleading for them to get off the jet, but they continued to smile and wave to their daughter, even showing the other passengers, pointing to her boastfully, their pride and joy in their daughter beyond measure. Mila quickly descended the escalator, though not by the stairs, but by climbing down the device from the other side, slipping and falling a short distance onto the runway tarmac as the wing passed overhead, knocking over the gigantic escalator. The terminal and garage door had disappeared, and they now were outside. The jet lined up with the runway and began to accelerate away from her as she chased it down the runway, screaming and crying as it picked up speed. The jet's nose then veered upward, ascending slowly into the sky as Mila's arms flailed frantically, trying to signal them to land, to stop. As the jet climbed further into the air and the night rapidly descended upon them, the runway lights came on, the jet now hundreds of feet in the air.
She watched as a tiny burst of light erupted from one of the wings, a tiny fire burst forth from one of its engines, and a trail of smoke emerged from it as the smell of burning jet fuel began to fill the air. The engine burst entirely into flames, which crawled the length of the wing towards the cabin as she watched in horror. She inhaled for one last scream and... Her eyes suddenly opened, and she was seated in the passenger seat of the Bentley, lost and confused. The driver beside her was pressing the horn when he realized she had awakened. "Did you sleep well?" he asked her, though she didn't reply. "Well, you will be happy to know we're here. This is your new home," he said with a smile on his face, as if everything was simply hunky-dory.
She looked at him with crazed eyes, underlined with smudged eyeliner and dried tears. He looked at her, staring in disbelief, before realizing she'd been in anguish. "Here, why don't you take this tissue here? Are you ready to... I'll get your luggage, and we'll just..." he said to her, offering her a tissue to wipe her eyes. She looked to it as if it were diseased, and then turned her attention to the door, prying the handle to get it open. You've got to unlock it first," he said to her. She quickly yanked the lock and then the handle, throwing the door open, quickly getting out, after which she began searching the sky. By that point, the driver had managed her luggage, carrying it all the way up to the double doors that made up her front entrance. "There you go. Will that be all?" he asked her, watching her as she continued scanning the sky for something she was searching for. "Do you, need some help?" he asked her again. I'm fine, thank you," she said to him, making her way to the front doors. When she arrived, she looked at him quizzically, as if to ask him why he was still there. "It's sometimes customary to, gratuity," he said to her. "Of course. Here." She faced him, reaching into her purse and retrieving her wallet from within, pulling a crisp Canadian $100 bill and handing it to him. "Thank you. Enjoy your new place," he said to her, quickly turning around and almost running for the driver's seat of the Bentley. As he drove away and back to the street, she unlocked the front door and stepped into her furnished two-bedroom home, where within she climbed the spiral staircase, finding her way to the master bedroom, where she threw herself at the bed and fell asleep for 2 days. On the Sunday morning she had awoken since having slept from the Friday afternoon, she quickly took a bubble bath, washing most of her trauma away. It had been a year since the accident, and she'd had much time to say goodbye to them, living it out in her dreams every single night for the previous year, for without that time she'd have never set foot in an airport, let alone a flight. As she sat in the bubble bath, she considered that perhaps when she'd boarded her flight to London from Pearson, that by that time, and unbeknown to her, that she had already been in shock, that the duration of the flight was simply a boiling kettle, her accumulated emotional pain building pressure until, when she'd landed at Heathrow, it was ready to burst, and that it did. She'd had similar episodes over the course of the year, some of them mild, and some of them quite pronounced. Regardless, she'd managed to get through all of them, sometimes after hours of crying, finding herself reliving a joyous memory of her time with them. Her pillow would be wet with tears at that point, while she'd struggle with emotions, and then all of the sudden, as if a beam of sunshine had poked its way through the darkest of clouds, she'd burst out laughing, like finding a gem in the midst of a pile of coal. A treasure trove of her family memories that had worked their way to the top just in time to save her. When the stormy days hit, and they had many times, she'd often find 1 or 2 memories whose cheer would guide her from the low spirits and despondency of darkness and into the joy and elation of light. She'd spent enough time in her lows since that fateful day and knew that her parents would want nothing more than for her to continue onward and confidently into life, her chin up and her spirits high, for despite their absence, she knew they'd always be a part of her, for they were closer than close. The trip to Shepperton was more than just to complete her schooling. It was about turning the page. It was about beginning a new chapter, and given the overwhelming loss with which she'd coped over the course of a year since their passing, it would be a chapter that she'd write, maybe for the first time in her life. A new beginning in her new home and with a new sense of purpose, waking up every morning in a new land. That morning she had unpacked her easel and set it up on the dock on the lake in her backyard, and under the light of the morning sun, and with a cup of her favorite tea on the table by her side, she began to paint a new life. To be continued in Tales of the Sanctum, the Era of the Spellbound, Episode 2, Friend and Foe Alike.